Thank you, Megan, and thank you, everyone at Culinary Mind for this invitation. I've known directly or indirectly many of you involved with the organization for some time, and I have at various points in the past and even today will be commenting on and including a lot of your work, which has been influential for mine. So there's a lot here, hopefully, that we can share. So I want to jump into my paper. It'll be about 30 minutes, hopefully, and I wanted to, it's more on the theoretical side, and I wanted to leave some room for conversation at the end, so we can perhaps place it into a little bit more of a kind of material or experiential context. As Megan said, the title of my paper today is on the use and abuse of recipes for life. So we already can guess that this is in somewhat of a Nietzschean key. And as I think some of you here are aware, just 2 days ago, my teacher and one of my mentors, Johnny Vattimo, passed away. And as you'll see from this paper, there is a lot of his work that is always present in mine. And so in many ways, when I refer to the kind of nihilistic endeavor that's here, it's always in the sense of the kind of weekend philosophy that he put forward. So let me begin with this, and then hopefully we can have a really nice conversation about recipes and how we might think through this a little bit more. So this all comes as part of a large project that I'm working on that I'm calling Recipes for the Good Life. So as the title, let me start my timer here so I can be on track. Okay. So as the title of my presentation suggests, the inspiration for my discussion today is the second of Nietzsche's untimely meditations, which reflects on his age's historical illness, an obsession with history that is destructive to the transformative power of life. This illness is particular to human life and consciousness, for we are neither like gods who view events outside the ravages of time in a superhistorical way, nor like animals who blissfully pass their time unhistorically, seeing, quote, each moment sink back into deep night, extinguished forever. The essay of Nietzsche's essay opens with the image of a herd grazing, of a herd eating, and living from moment to moment without a sense of its history or mortality. These beasts experience only the moment, which slips again and again into forgetting. Nietzsche wonders if for this very reason we are jealous of the animal because it finds happiness in the oblivion of the moment, submerged in the unceasing flow of life. Nietzsche, on reflection, boldly claims that whoever cannot settle on the threshold of the moment, forgetful of the whole past, and whoever is incapable of standing on a point like a goddess of victory without vertigo or fear will never know what happiness is, or worse yet, will never do anything to make others happy, end quote. I have always been struck by the implications of this essay. While it does not represent the mature height of Nietzsche's thinking, and for many of us today holds a problematic view of non-human consciousness, we nonetheless find in Nietzsche's admonition a crucial element of his overall hermeneutic. To live, and thus truly to be happy, requires transformation, and transformation does not require us to forget the past or sum it up in a tidy universal, but challenges us to understand the past, our individual and shared histories, differently. For beings like us, beings whose understanding is always shaped to a lesser or greater degree by a historical horizon populated with indigestible knowledge stones, as he calls them, that are detrimental to the flow of life, history, we might say an obsession with history, is the cause of the illness, but also part of the cure. The unhistorical and superhistorical tendencies, as he calls them, a sense of forgetting and a sense of the universal, quote, are natural antidotes to the stifling of life by history, end quote. But as we know from Nietzsche, we will also suffer from these antidotes. Nietzsche does not promise us a cure, but instead suggests a kind of immunization against our tendency to obsess over the past. So in this view of Nietzsche's, distinctions between ontology, epistemology, and ethics dissolve. And we might even say become aestheticized by a certain kind of tincture that he wants to prescribe to us. Being for us is knowing and understanding, and such knowing always risks pulling us out of the flow of life, out of our potential for transformation, out of our ability to respond to every new situation and truly live in touch with the moment. Not immersed in the supposed bliss of forgetting, but in touch with a form of happiness wagered upon the possibility of becoming who we truly are by also becoming something different through difference. Seeing the possibility of something different and new within the inheritances and artifacts that have already shaped who we understand ourselves to be. A promise of transformation and creativity always from within our situation and never ex nihilo. And it's in this key that I would like to explore what we might call the phenomenon of recipes, or as I sometimes like to call them, the gastronomical event of working through recipes. These texts, these historical documents, these artifacts that in many ways for us are not only the source of our problematic relations with the past, but also hold the opportunity for its transformation. So what is a recipe? As someone who cooks and thinks a lot about cooking, I wonder, should we aspire to stand upon that point that Nietzsche describes at the very threshold of forgetting? And can we presume an all-encompassing gaze and still find happiness, still find the good in a gastronomical environment that is quite simply saturated with the past, with conspicuous consumption, with false universals and promises of every variety? My discussion today is inspired neither by the search for the perfect recipe, nor the challenge of developing a metaphysics of the recipe. Rather, my starting point is the experiential encounter we have with recipes and how such experiences might guide us to a consideration of the good life, of ethics, in a decidedly hermeneutic and nihilistic key. Such experiences of recipes, I think, occur in various ways. We can imagine recipes that are tried and true staples in our repertoire, almost to the point of not having to think about them, deploying them almost thoughtlessly. Recipes that reproduce historical dishes or dishes from protected areas of the world. Recipes we attempt to cook for the very first time, or recipes designed to be replicated exactly, either in an industrial production line, or you might even think in a fine dining setting where the chef's exactitude is on display. Recipes become experiments, oftentimes, for tweaking and exploring new dishes. And of course, we've all had those recipes that are incomplete, ones we've inherited from others, ones that perhaps are damaged in some way and that we are forced to reconstruct. We modify recipes oftentimes for specific purposes, for religious or dietary restrictions of friends and guests at our house. And of course, we have all of those recipes yet to be written. These are just some of the experiences that we have with recipes, and it's certainly not an exhaustive list, but it speaks to the challenges of defining what a recipe is when we consider our role as readers and performers of recipes. Now, my working definition of a recipe, just to provide some context for our discussion, is as follows. A recipe is, point one, a form that transmits, or excuse me, a form of transmission, and it transmits two, knowledge about the preparation of a dish, three, for the ends of gastronomy. And gastronomy, as Savron explains in The Physiology of Taste, quote, is a scientific definition of all that relates to man as a feeding animal. Its goal is to watch over the preservation of man by means of the best possible food. This goal is certainly more than just nutritive. as the indicator of gastronomy's success is pleasure, with its ultimate goal, the most complete form of human flourishing. The key to living well, according to this science, is eating well. More than explaining just what to eat, gastronomy in this sense considers how we should eat in order to live well, thus emphasizing its decidedly ethical register. Gastronomy thus constitutes something more than a science or body of knowledge that can simply be systematized and transmitted in a universal way. It is practical knowledge that, unlike technical guidelines or practices, is transmitted through acts of transformative understanding that adapt to each and every particular situation. I don't doubt that each of us today can identify a recipe when we see one, but to develop a theory of recipe often means leaving behind their very particular materiality and situatedness, their embeddedness in culture and history, in favor of something that is more formal and secure, something that pulls us away from their living form and captures them in an oftentimes problematic notion of a universal. Nonetheless, I find some points of connection in recent studies of recipes that clarify my starting point. So I would say in a general sense, like Andrea Borghini's position, I would consider mine a constructivist notion of recipes. And I think I also find affinities with Giulio Sciacca's particularist metaphysics, which considers the recipe to be an artifact or a continuant. And my third touchstone is the sort of materialist or object-oriented philosophies espoused by many who have delved into the realm of food studies. But I could say that, for instance, Maya Hay's position, which sees recipes, quote, as a medium for materiality engaging with ever more corporeal, ever more intimate relations through food, mediate time, place, and ingredients and people in ways to show our relationality and our entanglement with non-human entities. Such accounts trace the ethical implications of recipes beyond their origins in human industry and creativity. And while they focus on material agency and object relations, I want to say that they do not ultimately give due attention to the very form of the recipe itself as a source of its normative force. So this is the avenue I'd like to explore now. That is, if we want to place recipes generally within this ethical register, within the pursuit of the good life, what is the source of a recipe's normativity? Where does it gain its normative force? Patrick English argues, quote, that certain traditional recipes and their instances, the dishes, along with their consumption, can be said to represent past living conditions, end quote, and thus carry with them a normative or ethical force. This plays out as a sort of hypothetical. If one wishes to reproduce a certain dish in a way intended by those who developed a certain recipe, then recipes as social and cultural artifacts, quote, have a certain normative force in terms of their having a guiding and not mere causal role in the realization of our goals and aims, end quote. English calls this a deflationary sense of normativity, given that recipes are normative only to the extent that we have goals and aims as culinary agents, and that, quote, recipes can, all things equal, be conducive to their realization, end quote. Recipes demand something of us, but here the source of normativity is extrinsic to the recipe itself and located in the aspirations and judgments of those who perform and experience the recipe. And on this point, I agree. But while a recipe is undoubtedly shaped by the intentions and experiences of those who create, use, and benefit from it, a recipe also carries with it an intrinsic normative force, I want to argue, precisely because the conditions in which recipes are applied, contrary to what English points out, never seem to be equal. I think this is the difference. Now, I also want to point to the work of Alessandro Bertinetto in his essay, Dishes as Performances, which provides the closest approximation, I would say, of my position on recipes. His argument involves an extended comparison between recipes and musical scores that draws upon his vast work on performance and improvisation and the arts. I'm gonna move a little bit quickly so I don't reiterate everything that he says here in the interests of time, but he understands dishes and musical performances as transformative of recipes and musical scores themselves, and they become codified and become objects of our interpretation in a notion akin to Gadamer's history of effects, or Gadamer's term Wirkungsgeschichte. Now, this reference to Gadamer reveals perhaps the deepest point of contact between Bertinetto's position and my own, a broadly hermeneutic approach that, in cases such as the musical score or recipe, places particular emphasis upon the role of application in the hermeneutic circle. For Bertinetto, the application of norms in the performance of a musical score or of a recipe, quote, requires creative adaptation to the concrete specific situation, and the final product emerges from the practical interactions that involve transformations of their own normative bases, end quote. These normative bases concern the choices of the artist or cook, often rooted in training and habit, along with the content of the musical score or the recipe. To play these notes in this particular way, or to prepare these ingredients using this particular method, not for the sake of the rule itself, but in order to apply the rule in a meaningful way that can be understood and appreciated by its audience. This normative change to the recipes, that is, suiting them to their situation, is not retroactive, he says, in the temporal sense, but recursive in that it modifies the structure of the norms, thus allowing the same content to register differently in a new situation. Musical works and recipes are thus ontologically flexible, as he calls them, because they, quote, are transformed by the performances that adapt them to specific physical and cultural situations. They are changing cultural artifacts. But even though the works and their norms are effectively transformed, Bertinetto still locates the impetus for their transformation in, quote, the concrete cultural and empirical situations, end quote, within which they are performed and evaluated. There is a great deal more in Bertinetto's essay that informs this discussion, particularly his reflection on the role of improvisation in the performance of a recipe. But what I hope to trace in the following is a deepening of that reflection to explore how the application of a recipe and the somewhat paradoxical orientations of habit and improvisation constitutive of that process reveal a recipe's inherently normative structure. So my goal here is to emphasize how application, this very specific moment that Gadamer highlights in his hermeneutic circle of understanding, how it relies upon the inherently normative form of recipes. And I too much to go into for this particular presentation, but the touchstone that I'm using here is Luigi Parison's notion of formativity and the aesthetic idea of a form. So when I talk about a form here in application, I don't mean a Platonic form, or I don't even mean a kind of universal concept that we might apply to the recipe. What I'm here thinking of primarily is something that creates its own norms through its process of emerging in an event. And so this will come out in my discussion of application, hopefully, but we can always go back to this idea too. So why do I want to focus on application? So when we think about recipes and we think about cooking, the term that I really want to rest on here is application. I think what we do when we engage with recipes and we cook and we change and modify them, or even when we follow them strictly, or think about writing our own recipes, what we are doing is what Gadamer identifies as application. So I want to propose that the performance of a recipe for the ends of gastronomy Cooking with a recipe should be understood as its application. Elsewhere, I have discussed cooking under the rubric of interpretation and how cooking enacts basic principles of hermeneutics. Here, I want to delve more deeply into one of those principles, the structure of the hermeneutic circle, and explore how application directs seemingly opposed behaviors, habit on the one hand and improvisation on the other, towards the realization of recipes, and reveals that normative force inherent in the very form of the recipe. To return again to Gadamer, application represents a, quote, recovery of the fundamental hermeneutical problem, end quote, because it addresses the issue of how a historically affected consciousness, how our deep experience of the world can bring about effusions of horizons, as he says, in a regulated way. And I'm going to run with Gadamer here, even though ultimately I want to bring some critique to this notion of regulation. To think of this directly in terms of recipes, what Gadamer is asking us to do is to think about how the performance of a recipe demands a fusion of past experiences and knowledge, what he calls four understandings, with the goals and desires of the cook, of the recipe, and the broader audience and cultural context into which it is performed. Or, as I mentioned earlier, in reference to Nietzsche, does a recipe demand in its application that we stand upon the threshold of the present between absolute knowing and its universal application, and, on the other hand, absolute forgetting and completely unguided and, in perhaps the worst sense, of improvisation, a kind of creation ex nihilo. How do we ensure that we are neither blindly trying to recreate what has already occurred in the past, following the recipe strictly, or disregarding the recipe in the service of our immediate desires? We feel the pull of the former, that is the past, in the fascination with authentic food and recipes, as if the discussion of the discovery of the right recipe and its proper execution could recreate a lost taste of home, or even transport an eater through time and space to an unreachable locale. And we entertain the folly of the latter, not simply in the pursuit of our hedonic impulses, but often when our most noble intentions take priority over a sensitivity to context and culture. And so we can also oftentimes think of the ways that we import recipes into contexts without a sensitivity to those who would be eating those foods or benefiting from those things. So application is thus not merely the performance of a recipe through the act of cooking to produce the dish, but more importantly, marks a broader engagement of practical wisdom in the pursuit of gastronomic ends. One interprets a recipe in order to achieve the ends of gastronomy. Now, what I want to say here, just kind of glancing at the time, that let me say that if we accept this notion of application, and that it means that we are going to understand the text or the recipe in the moment, in the concrete situation, always in a new and different way, then I want to turn our focus to the way in which a recipe is oriented towards its own past and future possibilities in the service of gastronomy through practices of habit and improvisation. So habits in the kitchen. To say habits play a role in the application of recipes is neither surprising nor controversial. These could be good habits cultivated over time that include careful reading, cooking techniques, familiarity with types of recipes and dishes, knowledge about ingredient substitutions, and the ritual of mise en place, just to name a few things. There are also bad habits that include inattentiveness to details, sloppy measurement, not tasting through the process of cooking, and so on. And there is, of course, a degree of relativity in these distinctions that depends on the type of cooking and venue in which it takes place, along with one's own personal tastes and preferences. Nonetheless, these habits are relevant to Gadamer's understanding of application in two ways. The first concerns my definition of recipes in service of gastronomy, which, as I noted, aims towards the overall health and flourishing of humanity. The second, which is of central importance to Gadamer, regards the way that the development and learning of moral knowledge participates in the structure of the hermeneutic circle. And this is a really key moment in Gadamer's Truth and Method, when he delves into an exploration of application, particularly in relation to legal and theological hermeneutics. He makes a detour into Aristotle and speaks very specifically about how Aristotle's notion of the acquisition of moral knowledge really provides the model for the hermeneutic circle that's at work in the way that we apply our understanding to texts. So, we might say, in simpler terms, the performance of good habits is never enough, given the very structure of any and all understanding. And to understand our own habits is to open them up to continual revision and to recognize their contingency, despite the sometimes seemingly universal and natural force upon which they act, or they act upon us. So through his reading of Aristotle, Gadamer notes that, quote, the basis of moral knowledge is striving, or exis, desire, and its development into a fixed demeanor, hexis, end quote. This moral knowledge is not episteme, but rather knowledge understood as, quote, something that the human has to do, a process of formation that develops and transforms in the structure of a circle. It is recursive and cannot not, in its outcomes, also include new seeds of striving and desire to continue the process. Likewise, I would say recipes are open-ended in that they ultimately point beyond themselves to a dish that will be performed and realized and ultimately evaluated or understood only in light of the very process that first brought it into being, thus leaving open the possibility of its revision and transformation again and again. Unlike a technical text, the desire motivating a recipe's application is not universal applicability, but application that can only be realized through the particulars of a recipe, its material resources, its cultural and social context, and even the individual taste of those who prepare and experience it. So while technical knowledge and moral knowledge both include the same task of application, Gadamer tells us, application's normative force is distinct in that we do not simply possess moral knowledge like a tool that can be put to work to achieve a specific end in a blindly habitual manner. Coming to know and acquire this type of knowledge is intertwined with its application and not determined entirely by its end result. The cultivation of good habits in the kitchen, we might say, thus has the goal of a demeanor that is fixed only to the extent that it remains open to unforeseen contingencies and new situations. This type of practical knowing is what Aristotle famously calls phronesis, and the recipe serves as a model for a unique type of flexible norm that can be realized only through its ongoing transmission and transformation. Now, we might say, on the other hand, while strangely habit, which arises out of the past, has a strangely futural orientation, that improvising oddly, this kind of performing in the moment, working towards the unforeseen, is oriented towards the past. The application of recipe, we know, oftentimes demands a good deal of improvisation, at times dramatically, but perhaps more commonly in implicit and understated ways that build upon the habitual experiences of a cook. This is well documented in Bertinetto's treatment of recipes and builds upon his own aesthetics of improvisation. So here I will simply begin where my view diverges from his, namely the normative force inherent in recipes in their improvisational application. whereas the normative force connected to habit is oriented towards the development of practical moral knowledge that remains open to contingencies akin to phronesis. The normative force connected to improvisation, paradoxically, is oriented towards an evaluation of what we already know and what the recipe already contains, historically, materially, and formally. The recipe demands that we understand it on its own terms before we realize it and potentially transform it through its application. We must answer to the history of the recipe in order to continue its history within a new context. To improvise is to grapple with the possible in relation to an actual past. That is the possible future in relation to an actual past, rather than to believe we can construct something ex nihilo that was truly unforeseeable. And when I say that we have to deal with the form of the recipe on its own terms, historically, I don't mean, in a sense of we have to bow down before the canon of certain recipes. What I intend here is that we come to recognize that what seems fixed in the past, what seems history, that history documents transformation, that we understand that even something that can no longer change is born out of those same sorts of contingencies that we are grappling with as we orient ourselves towards possibilities in the future. So the recipe, when understood as a technical plan for success, favors stability and reproducibility over its contextual sensitivity and improvisation. And yet, it is precisely the measures often taken to ensure success in the kitchen, a success judged according to standards of repetition and consistency, that expose the limitations of habit and create an opportunity for improvised behavior. So we might say that in the former case of the technical text, the directions and procedures of the recipe assume and often obscure the hours of training and experience that are embodied in the action a recipe might require. Knife skills, multitasking, order and organization of preliminary ingredients, the haptic and visual cues associated with readiness, the dexterity required to knead or fold or form. Even when these are learned through demonstration, the gap between a skilled cook's habits and the novice cook reveal what has been taken for granted or simply obscured by many recipes understood simply as technical texts that are set in stone. More interesting, we might say, are the places where the recipe yields its unexpected opportunities for improvisation through those prescriptions. This might occur also through an indifference to those very prescriptions, but I think what's more compelling are the cases where the rigid guidelines of the recipe, through their encounter with difference, through their application, reveal the limits of the recipe to the attentive cook who, regardless of skill level, is open to learning and even to unlearning when the recipe enters that new context and reveals once again that sort of hermeneutic circle at the core of its normative structure. I say a little bit more here going back to Bertonetto about this process of unlearning. But let me skip now so we can work towards a conclusion and we have time for conversation. I would perhaps say here that improvisation forces us to unlearn what we have learned, but simultaneously relies on that. And that in the encounter with the recipe, we find the recipe is not a universal form that can simply be applied to the situation in a routine or habitual manner, but that seeking to understand this universal, to understand what it says, what constitutes the text meaning and significance, requires that one relate the recipe to its encountered situational differences when we apply it. So on the one side, we find that application involves habit, that is always on the way to its questioning and reformulation. More than repetition, it is a demeanor that responds to the demands of the recipe's application. And on the other side, the application of a recipe involves improvisation, not as an act of creation ex nihilo, but as a practice rooted in and made possible by the very habits practiced by the cook and encoded in the recipe itself. In such a light, habit and improvisation appear less like a dialectical pair in tension and more like the engines of the hermeneutic circle directed towards the realization of a gastronomical and thus an ethical end. And so those varying types of recipes that I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation, or the kinds of experiences we can have with recipes, these might be something that we can reflect on in our conversation a little bit, and might comprise, I think, a kind of phenomenology of these recipe experiences. But let me conclude by saying this, returning to our beginning. As I mentioned earlier, perhaps the very form of a recipe demands that we stand on that threshold Nietzsche presents us with between absolute knowing on the one hand and absolute forgetting on the other. How do we ensure that in our culinary practices that we are neither blindly trying to recreate the past nor disregarding it in the service of our immediate desires? My reflections today entertain the possibility that there is something in the very form of the recipe, a form that is neither universal nor simply a quirk of human evolution, but an event of human existence that, like all events, emerges from and simultaneously shapes the horizon within which we encounter it. It is fair to say that in our gastronomic being, as gastronomic beings, I would say, we have become, as Nietzsche feared, obsessed with certain indigestible knowledge stones, not realizing that history is a document of transformation rather than a document that chronicles what is constantly changing. That history, excuse me, let me say that again. Not realizing that history is a document of transformation rather than a document of what is unchanging and forever locked in the past. I suggest that recipes, while certainly suffering from what Nietzsche described as his historical illness, might provide us with some insight into a cure for this malady. A recipe, if you will, true to the word's etymology as a medical prescription. The cure possesses something of a universal and also something of an immediate. However, both appear to us in their weakened forms. Habit as an evolving grammar of human activity, and improvisation as its dynamic force in the sense of that which prescribes for us its possibilities and its potential. This notion of application highlights the use of recipes for the ends of gastronomy and the pursuit of the good life. But as we know all too well from our own experiences in the kitchen, recipes are not always foolproof, and their uses also share in the origin of their abuses. Thank you.